Racist judge laughs at simple woman in court, then discovers she's a genius attorney. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. It started with a laugh. Not the kind that comes from joy or even irony, but the sharp, dismissive laugh of a man who believed himself above everyone else in the room. A man who had grown too comfortable behind the bench, too sure of his own power. Judge Franklin M. Hayes leaned back in his chair, his gavel resting idle in his hand, and let out a dry chuckle. "Hey, you're representing yourself?" he asked, peering over his glasses at the woman standing at the defendant's table. "You do understand this is a court of law, not a sewing circle." The courtroom rippled with quiet chuckles. A few spectators grinned. Some lawyers exchanged glances, and the bailiff, who should have known better, let the corners of his mouth twitch upward. But the woman didn't flinch. She stood in a simple blue dress, faded at the edges, holding a manila folder tight against her chest. Her brown flats had seen better days, and her hair was pulled back in a loose bun that suggested function over fashion. Her name was Evelyn Carter, and to the eyes of most in that room, she looked like someone who'd wandered in from a grocery store parking lot by mistake. "Your Honor," Evelyn said, her voice even calm, "and I understand exactly where I am." Hayes raised an eyebrow, bemused. "But do you have any legal training, Miss Carter?" Evelyn hesitated for a beat, not out of uncertainty, but as if she were deciding how much of herself to reveal. Enough. That answer didn't help her case in the eyes of the courtroom, and it only seemed to further amuse Judge Hayes. He waved a hand dismissively. "Very well. But let me caution you, this isn't small claims court. You're facing a team of corporate lawyers from one of the largest real estate firms in the state. You're out of your depth." "Appreciate your concern," Evelyn said simply. From the plaintiff's side, slick-suited attorneys leaned in over their files, whispering and smirking. The lead counsel, Peter Langston, was already drafting the motion to dismiss her claim. He'd handled dozens of these cases before. Tenants trying to stop evictions, all claiming hardship, discrimination, some even claiming fraud. They never won, especially not when they came in without representation, especially not when they looked like Evelyn. Langston stood, addressing the court. "In Your Honor, as we stated in our motion, the property was sold legally, and all notices were provided well within the statutory period. Ms. Carter has no lease, and we have no record of rent payment for the past 3 months. This case has no merit." Evelyn opened her folder. Judge Hayes barely looked at her. "And Miss Carter, you may proceed, but again, this court cannot waste time with baseless arguments." Evelyn didn't look flustered. She placed a document gently on the podium in front of her and spoke clearly, though quietly. "This is a receipt for my rent payment 2 weeks ago," she said, lifting the paper. "And paid in cash, as I always have. The landlord, Mr. Callan, refused to provide me a lease, but I have 12 years of receipts and bank statements showing consistent rent payments. I also have text from Mr. Callan threatening eviction unless I agreed to pay nearly double the rent or vacate the unit." A few heads turned. Judge Hayes looked at her for the first time. Really looked. Still, his voice was laced with condescension. "On texts? From a cell phone?" Evelyn nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Screenshots, plus a sworn affidavit from a neighbor who witnessed the threats in person." Langston's confident posture faltered for the first time. He shuffled some papers in front of him, then glanced at one of his associates who was already tapping away on a tablet. Hayes adjusted in his seat. "And what exactly is your defense, Miss Carter? That you've been victimized? That this is a form of, what, housing discrimination?" Evelyn looked him straight in the eye, her gaze steady and unreadable. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe the eviction is retaliatory and discriminatory, and I intend to prove it violates the Fair Housing Act." You could feel the temperature shift in the room. Judge Hayes' face changed subtly, not alarmed, but something else. Calculating. His tone stayed patronizing, but a touch more cautious now. "So you believe the Fair Housing Act applies in this case?" "Yes," Evelyn replied. "Section 818, interference, coercion, and intimidation. The landlord's actions fall squarely within prohibited conduct, and I have corroborating testimony." Langston scoffed. "This is outrageous. She's cherry-picking statutes she doesn't understand." Evelyn didn't look at him. She pulled another page from her folder. "I also have a notarized letter from a former tenant. Same landlord, similar threats. He was evicted after refusing to pay increased rent without a lease. He's prepared to testify." That silenced even Langston for a moment. Judge Hayes didn't like it. He leaned forward now, the amusement gone from his face. You're saying you've assembled witnesses, documentation, and a legal argument, all by yourself? Evelyn simply nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The judge narrowed his eyes at her. Where did you say you went to school, Miss Carter? And I didn't, she said. And your occupation? Evelyn paused, just long enough to be noticed. And I clean houses, and I raised 3 children. One's a nurse, another's a public school teacher. The youngest is in college, studying law. A few more heads turned. A few smirks faded. The silence in the room was thick now, tight with an energy no one could quite name yet. Judge Hayes tapped the gavel lightly on the bench, not as a ruling, more like a nervous tick. This court will take a brief recess before proceeding. As people stood and shuffled, whispers moved like wind through the aisles. Some spectators stayed seated, watching Evelyn as if they'd missed something before, but were seeing her with new eyes. Langston, clearly rattled, turned to his assistant. Where the hell did she get that statute? Evelyn stood still, her folder still clutched in her arms, eyes calmly scanning the courtroom. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, but the fire beneath her stillness burned quietly, powerfully. She wasn't there to entertain. She wasn't there to impress. She was there for justice. And now, suddenly, people started to wonder if she just might get it. Court resumed 15 minutes later, but everything felt different. Gone was the smug certainty that had filled the room when Evelyn first stepped to the defense table. The mood had shifted, quietly but unmistakably. The chuckles had stopped. Even Judge Hayes sat a little straighter in his chair, as if the robe on his shoulders had suddenly grown heavier. And Miss Carter, the judge began, with less sarcasm this time, to may continue presenting your defense. Evelyn stepped forward with that same calm presence. She didn't speak like someone trying to prove herself. She spoke like someone who already knew the truth, and was simply walking the room toward it. I'd like to submit Exhibit C, she said, holding up a folder. Untext message transcripts between myself and Mr. Callan, including timestamps, which clearly show he threatened to double my rent unless I paid in cash with no lease. She handed them to the bailiff, who brought them to the judge and plaintiff's counsel. Langston took the papers, his eyes scanning quickly. His confident smirk had returned, if only for a moment. Your Honor, with all due respect, text messages can be fabricated. They're hardly substantial evidence in a case like this. Evelyn didn't blink. And I also subpoenaed the cell phone records from my provider. They corroborate the message dates and times. Those logs were sent directly to the court by the carrier's legal department. You should have received them this morning. Hayes frowned and leaned to his clerk. A quick exchange followed, hushed, followed by a nod. They're here, the clerk confirmed, placing a sealed envelope on the bench. Judge Hayes opened it, scanned the top page, and paused. For the first time, his expression wasn't dismissive. It was something else now. Something closer to concern, or maybe curiosity. He looked back up at Evelyn. And you prepared all this on your own? Yes, Your Honor. I knew how to file subpoenas. Yes, the process is publicly available. I also spoke to a legal aid advisor, but they were overbooked and couldn't take my case, so I researched a lot. Langston stepped forward. Even if these messages are legitimate, there's no evidence of discrimination. That's a serious accusation. Evelyn's voice sharpened, still calm but edged now with heat. Mr. Callan raised rent on only 2 tenants, myself and Mrs. Nguyen, who's a Vietnamese immigrant. He claimed market rates justified it, but every other unit stayed the same price. And the 2 of us were the only ones without formal leases. Langston blinked. Evelyn turned to the judge. Unobtained sworn statements from 3 neighbors, all of whom confirmed they were never asked to pay more, and all of whom have leases. I also have utility records that show a consistent tenancy for over a decade, along with evidence that Mr. Callan refused to cash my checks for the past 3 months, forcing me to pay in cash. Judge Hayes studied her. He looked irritated, but not at her anymore. At the situation, at the fact that this simple woman had come into his courtroom and backed a team of corporate lawyers into a corner with precision and poise. And the witness you mentioned earlier? He asked. And the former tenant? He's waiting outside, Evelyn replied. His name is Rafael Delgado. He was evicted from a similar property owned by the same company, also without a lease and after refusing a rent increase. Langston tried to interject, but Hayes held up a hand. Let's bring him in. The bailiff stepped out and returned with a thin, soft-spoken man in his late 40s. Rafael spoke with a noticeable accent, his hands twisting nervously. But when he recounted his experience, being harassed, threatened, and eventually forced out, his voice found steady footing. When they told me I was lucky they even let me stay, that I should be quiet. When I asked for a lease, they said I didn't need one if I paid on time. And who told you this? The judge asked. Same man, Mr. Callan. Evelyn offered a printed copy of Raphael's prior eviction records and utility shutdown notices. Hayes accepted it without a word. The silence in the room now was thick. You could feel the walls closing in on Langston and his team, who were furiously whispering among themselves. Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat, as if realizing this case was no longer the open and shut dismissal he had assumed. Then he did something surprising. He leaned forward, staring directly at Evelyn. Miss Carter, have you studied law formally at any point? Evelyn hesitated again, just a breath, but it said everything. She knew this moment was coming. And I took some law school courses, years ago, she said slowly. And before life got complicated, before my husband passed, before I had to clean houses just to keep food on the table. A quiet gasp slipped from someone in the back row. Hayes sat back in his chair, eyes still fixed on her. And you could have led with that. Yeah, I could have, Evelyn said, her voice steady. But I didn't want that to be the reason anyone listened to me. The judge's expression froze. The truth in that sentence, unvarnished and uncomfortable, hung heavy in the air. He'd laughed at her. So had the room. And they hadn't laughed because she lacked ability. They'd laughed because of what she looked like, how she dressed, how she spoke. Because she didn't fit the mold. Now, that mold was cracking. So I believe I have enough to proceed to trial, Hayes said, his voice clipped. Langston blurted, Your Honor, this case is still based on circumstantial. Hayes cut him off. So Mr. Langston, you'll have your opportunity to refute the evidence in trial. But if even half of what Miss Carter has presented holds up under cross-examination, your client may be facing more than just a civil suit. Langston fell silent. Evelyn remained calm, nodding once. Court was adjourned for the day. People began to rise, whispering again, but this time with a different tone. Respect, curiosity, maybe even admiration. As Evelyn gathered her papers, she felt a tap on her shoulder. It was an older black woman in the gallery, tears in her eyes. Oh, my daughter's going through something just like this, she whispered. It made them listen. Thank you. Evelyn smiled, quietly, but as she walked out of the courtroom, her eyes locked one last time with Judge Hayes. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. But he didn't laugh either. And that, after all this, was a start. The courthouse buzzed with quiet electricity the next morning. Word had spread, first among the clerks, then through the court officers, and eventually even into the gallery seats. This cleaning lady, who got laughed at, had dismantled a seasoned legal team with precision and grace. No one said it out loud, but people came in early, hoping she'd show up again. Evelyn Carter did. Same plain navy skirt, same worn heels, same no-nonsense demeanor. Only this time, people didn't avert their eyes when she passed. Some nodded respectfully. A few smiled. She walked with purpose, clutching a worn manila folder close to her chest like it held secrets no one else had earned the right to see. Inside the courtroom, Judge Hayes glanced up as she entered. His gaze lingered longer than before, an acknowledgement, maybe even a reevaluation. But Evelyn didn't come to bask in that. She came with work to do. Langston was already seated at the plaintiff's table, jaw tight, shoulders squared. His client, Mr. Callan, didn't look nearly as confident as he had 2 days ago. He sat stiffly, lips pressed thin, fingers drumming impatiently. When court was called to order, Judge Hayes got straight to it. And Miss Carter, he said, requested access to prior tenant filings connected to Mr. Callan's properties? Yes, Your Honor. I was granted access to the county record room yesterday afternoon. She stepped forward and placed the manila folder on the evidence table. With careful hands, she spread out copies of eviction notices, rent adjustment forms, and court filings, all with the same signatures, the same patterns. These are public records of 7 former tenants across 3 of Mr. Callan's buildings, she said. In all, either immigrants or people of color. None of them had formal leases. All were evicted or pressured to leave after sudden rent increases. Judge Hayes flipped through the pages, his expression hardening with each document. And also found something else, Evelyn added, and this time her voice dipped into something more personal. And these people never fought back. Not because they were guilty, but because they couldn't afford attorneys, or didn't believe the courts would hear them. She looked up at the bench. That's why I had to take this on myself." A silence settled like fog. Evelyn let it hang, unafraid of its weight. Then she continued, "There's one more piece of evidence, something that ties all this together." She handed over an audio file transcript. This was recorded on my phone during a conversation with Mr. Callan last month when he came to my apartment to collect cash. He didn't know he was being recorded. The transcript read, "Callan, and you people never stay long. Always think you're owed something. I'm not here to play charity case with you, Evelyn." "Evelyn, what do you mean, you people?" "Callan, I know what I mean. I let you stay here for cheap for years. Don't make me regret that." Langston jumped to his feet. Honor. That recording is inadmissible without consent." Judge Hayes didn't even look up. And New York is a one-party consent state. If she recorded a conversation she was part of, it's legal. Sit down. Langston sat. Callan looked like he'd swallowed glass. Hayes skimmed the transcript again, then set it down slowly, like it physically burned to touch. For the first time, Evelyn saw it. Shame, regret, something cracking behind the judge's usual wall of condescension. He cleared his throat. "I'll be forwarding this matter to the district attorney's office. In the meantime, we will move to formal trial procedures unless a settlement is proposed." Langston whispered furiously with his client, but Evelyn didn't flinch. She wasn't here for silence money. Then, something unexpected happened. "Your Honor," Evelyn said, "I'd like to propose a resolution." Hayes raised a brow. "You're offering a settlement?" "Yes, but not for me." She took a deep breath. "I want Mr. Callan to agree to lease renewals with fair rent and written contracts for the remaining tenants in his buildings. I want formal apologies issued to the former tenants forced out, and I want a written statement submitted to the housing authority admitting his discriminatory practices. In return, I'll drop my personal damages claim." Gasps rippled through the room. Langston looked like he'd been sucker punched. Judge Hayes stared at her. "You'd give up compensation you're owed?" "I didn't fight this to get rich," Evelyn replied. "I fought so people like me would stop being treated like dirt. Money doesn't fix that. Accountability does." For a long moment, Hayes didn't speak. Then he turned to Langston. "Counselor, you might want to advise your client to accept that offer, because if this goes to trial, the outcome will be significantly worse for both of you." Langston whispered again, and Callan's face twisted, rage, embarrassment, maybe even fear. But eventually, he nodded. Accept, Langston said reluctantly. Judge Hayes looked at Evelyn. His voice for once was steady. "End request granted. The settlement terms will be entered into the record, and your suit is considered resolved." Court adjourned. As Evelyn packed her papers, Judge Hayes called her name. She turned. "I misjudged you," he said simply. "And I'm sorry." Evelyn held his gaze. For the first time, he didn't look down on her. "You didn't misjudge me," she said, "and you just never tried to see me." And then she walked out, not with anger, not with revenge, but with dignity, with peace. She stepped into the bright spring light outside the courthouse, exhaling deeply. Around her, people gathered. Some shook her hand. Others just watched with quiet admiration, not as a maid, not as a nobody, but as the woman who made them listen. 2 weeks had passed since the case closed. In the courthouse halls, the whispers hadn't stopped, but the tone had changed. No one laughed anymore when Evelyn Carter's name was mentioned. They didn't smirk, didn't roll their eyes. They spoke it with something approaching reverence and a quiet sort of awe. Judge Hayes had requested a meeting with Evelyn, not in court, not behind a bench, but over coffee. He waited at a quiet cafe 2 blocks from the courthouse, nervously checking the time, unsure if she would even show up. He wouldn't have blamed her if she didn't. But at exactly 10 a.m., Evelyn walked in, her same worn leather purse slung over one shoulder, her walk steady and sure. She wore a soft gray sweater and jeans this time, but her posture was the same, unflinching, unapologetic. She sat across from him with a small, polite nod. Hayes cleared his throat. "So I wanted to thank you for agreeing to meet. I owe you more than an apology." Evelyn looked him in the eye. "And don't waste time apologizing. Do something better with it." That startled him, but it didn't feel like a rebuke. It felt like an invitation. "I've been a judge for nearly 2 decades, he said slowly. "And I always told myself I was fair, that I followed the law. But I realize now, I've spent years seeing people through the wrong lens, through my comfort, my bias. Evelyn didn't respond right away. She let the silence hang, just long enough for it to sting. Then she spoke softly. And I don't need you to feel bad. I need you to see the people who come into your courtroom, really see them. The single moms, the immigrants, the tenants without leases, the ones who don't speak perfect English, or who come in wearing worn-out shoes. She leaned forward. And you don't know how hard it is to stand in front of someone who's already decided you don't belong. Hayes looked down. He nodded slowly. You're right. I know, she said, gently but firmly. Then he surprised her again. And I've started speaking to the Judicial Review Board. We're launching an internal assessment of landlord-tenant bias in our court decisions. And I've volunteered to mentor young clerks on recognizing structural prejudice in case reviews. Your case was the wake-up call I needed. For the first time, Evelyn smiled, not wide, not gloating, but quietly, gratefully. That's a good start, she said, but it can't end there. Hayes gave a sheepish chuckle. So you ever think about finishing law school? I could write you one hell of a recommendation. Evelyn looked out the window, her eyes following the soft movement of the morning crowd. Then she turned back to him. Son, I used to think law school was the only way to make change. But now I know. Change starts the moment you stop waiting for permission to speak. She stood, shook his hand, and left him with that. Back in her neighborhood, Evelyn found something unexpected waiting. People. Word had traveled fast. Tenants from all 3 buildings owned by Mr. Callan had banded together to form a tenants' rights group. They called it Dunanda Carter Collective. They met every Wednesday night in the church basement down the street. When she walked in that night, a dozen people stood and clapped. She laughed, awkward and embarrassed. But they wouldn't let her shrink back. And Miss Carter, one of the younger women said, Jasmine, who worked part-time at the grocery store, and made us believe we didn't have to be scared, that we deserve better. You showed us how to fight smart. Evelyn shook her head. Penn didn't show you anything you didn't already have inside. Pineda made us believe it, Jasmine replied. That night, Evelyn didn't lecture. She listened. She helped them draft letters to the city housing board. She explained how to file repair orders, how to document unfair practices, how to stand together. One by one, people began finding their voice. Months passed. The judge who once laughed at her would later cite Evelyn's case in a lecture at a judicial conference on systemic bias. The audio clip she submitted became part of a training module for city housing officials. 3 of Callan's former tenants sued and won settlements. But Evelyn didn't brag about any of that. She stayed where she was, in the same modest apartment, the same neighborhood, still cleaning houses part-time, still volunteering her evenings to help others find their footing. She never did return to law school. She didn't need to, because in every courtroom whisper, in every neighbor's voice that now spoke up instead of staying silent, her legacy lived on. One afternoon, as she was leaving the library, a young woman approached her, nervous, clutching a backpack, maybe 19 or 20. Miss Carter? She asked. Evelyn turned. Yes. Sigh, I heard about what you did, with the case, with the housing stuff. I just got into community college. I want to study law, but I don't know where to start. Evelyn smiled, a real one this time, warm and wide. You just did, she said. She handed the girl her number and promised to meet her for coffee that weekend, because that's what real change looks like. Not headlines, not courtroom drama, but one quiet act of courage, rippled outward, again and again, until the world has no choice but to listen. She didn't wear a fancy suit or carry a law degree, but she carried the truth. And sometimes, that's the loudest voice in the room. If you were moved by Evelyn's story, don't forget to share it, because someone out there might just need the reminder that they matter too.